I don't think there was one moment where I wanted to be an architect. I was interested in the creative side of architecture, and I had a kind of a science maths background, and architecture brings these quite well together because it has an artistic side and it has a technical side, and I like the relationship between the two. The strongest moment when I was impressed by architecture was when my parents were building a house back in Iran, and I remember going to the meetings that my parents were going to with the architect. I found them exciting.
And where did you study? What was your first school?
I went to boarding school here as of the age of 14. I went for my first 3 years of architecture, I went to Dundee in Scotland, and then I went to the Bartlett, and after that I went to Harvard for a graduate.
Any particularly influential teachers of architecture or tutors, either at Dundee or the Bartlett?
At the Bartlett, David Dunster, who was running really the program, and well, he was an exciting and charismatic figure. It was a different experience to my experience at Dundee, which was divided very clearly, the technical and the artistic side of architecture. We had one set of presentations for the project, and we had another set of presentations for how the project would be built. It was kind of quite divided. It taught you, of course, also the technical side that probably the Bartlett was not at all focused on when I joined it, and so I feel in hindsight that I benefited from that initial 3 years, despite the fact that it wasn't in London, etc. It gave me probably something close to what most European students have, say if you study in Spain, where you do have more of a technical education, a more perhaps thorough introduction to the history of architecture. By the time I landed at the Bartlett, it didn't feel quite as structured, but I was by then really ready to be freer from the disciplinary constraints, and so I enjoyed my 2 years at the Bartlett. It was good to be in London anyway.
And I gather that Zaha Hadid played a part in your move to Harvard.
Yes, I used to work as an intern in her office, all my holidays as a student, and when I was finishing my final year at the Bartlett, I would be showing her my project, and she asked me what I was going to do, and of course I could see nothing beyond my final project then, but I did end up applying, and through her recommendation, and I ended up going to Harvard. I ended up experiencing both Raphael Moneo as being the chair of the department and Max Coggin, two great characters, very open-minded. Of course, Raphael Moneo is very interested in the history and the discipline, and Max Coggin is very much the opposite in a way. It was a time before September 11th when there were also a lot more Europeans. The demographics were different going to the US then. Quite a rich culture of students. It was great.
And when you came back to Britain, I suppose this was the start of your life as simultaneously design architect, but also somebody who's taught. How did that come about?
Well, I went to work for Rem Koolhaas OMA after Harvard, and then started teaching here at DAA with my ex-partner, Alejandro Zairo, and teaching and practice were concurrent. Teaching was food for thought, but also a way of living, and starting an office. And well, that's how we started.
And the office was called Foreign Office. And then, I suppose to everybody's amazement, this tiny, tiny office of kind of teachers won an extraordinarily huge project in Yokohama, the Yokohama Port project. Did you think you were going to win when you did the entry, or was it a sort of theoretical exercise?
We didn't think we would win, but we did it to win. And I think the projects that we've done for competitions, whether it is at the FOA days or now, they take on the project in its full seriousness as a piece of architecture to be done. So they are never done just to be printed. And so it was taking on all the issues of a ferry terminal, you know, how to activate a ferry terminal that is most often very empty, how to deal with a very large structure in the city, how to use its size as a way to trigger certain urban regenerative aspects for the city. Of course, we had a very different way of looking at it, and it was, I think it's to this day, I'm still amazed that it was chosen and that it was built. We worked again, after winning it, we worked very hard to think it through, to develop it, and not to keep it just as a competition entry that gets realized. And you know, I'm very proud that it works really well.
And I suppose that it was a shock, I think, to the architectural establishment, because I think for the first time on a major project, the ideas that you were promoting and that were in the ether at the AA at that time, this notion of folding planes, suddenly there it was actually being built. Now I think that almost the physical act of getting that design and that project completed meant that you were working under extraordinary pressure out in Yokohama, 18 hours a day. I mean, that's the story. Was that what it was like for a couple of years?
Yes. Well, the project took 10 years from the beginning to the end. It took 2 years on site. It took a year before that, quite intense, like 18 hours, to produce the construction drawings. But I would do it again. It was hard work, but I would do it again.
And actually that theme of having control is not really the right word, but having complete engagement with construction details, I mean, almost back to Dundee, yes. But not seeing architecture as a theoretical exercise where it's an idea which somebody else can build in any way they want. But you've pursued this in the rest of your career today, this attention to how things are made, how they're put together, precisely what the materials are.
Yes, I think the experiment of Yokohama is, there is a side to it that is aside from, there's a project to it, which is not just inside of the project of a ferry terminal, its scale, etc., but it's the relationship between the experience of architecture, the form, and its construction, its engineering, its construction, its materiality, and I think it's somehow moved with the FOA post Yokohama, and I think in the work and the research I do, the function books are very much about that. They are very much about the experience and the construction. There are intentionally double spreads. On one side you see an image which is a kind of a snapshot of what this other side, which are the layers of perhaps more practical side of architecture that are informative. And the two, it's not one producing the other, it's about a constant dialogue between the two.
Tell us more about the function books.
The first one has been the ornament book. It came out of several years of working on retail projects, and I realized that architects were being increasingly asked to design just the shell of the building and not the inside, and told to do something very interesting. And it was an extremely difficult problem. And I thought, well, we cannot just end up becoming decorators. How is this? How can this be seen or articulated as a piece of architecture? And this is when I tried, through teaching, to contextualize it in a kind of a review of envelopes of 20th century, exemplary 20th century buildings, looking at what had led to their design. And curiously, if you look at them, they are not informed by the core or the inside. They are envelope designs. They are highly influential in the way they influence both the inside and the outside, but they are a thing in their own right. But they are constructed, they have their own system and logic, they are an act of architecture. So the ornament book really started out by saying designing the envelopes of the buildings does not have to be a piece of decoration. It can be tied to the construction system, but it doesn't have to be about transparency and just representing the inside. It can actually be a kind of an in-between layer between the inside and outside. This went on to form, and the function of form was trying to, again, deal with another contemporary problem, which is the problem of the divide between form as geometry and architectural projects being also about the built reality, the physical object that has structure and has to deal with gravity and loads, etc. And so it brought structure and form together. These are a number of polarities that has gone on for years in the history of architecture, that I felt that we no longer had to keep as dualities or polarities, that we have tools and ways of thinking that we can bring them together. So it looked at the form book, looked at the history of architecture back to Gothic cathedrals. But seeing that there is this relationship between structure and form is not one producing the other, but the two producing each other. And that there is an elastic relationship, and actually architects define that precise relationship in each particular situation. Style has come out from both. I mean, in a way, form, ornament, and style are three concepts that historically architecture has used to talk about the aesthetic experience of buildings. It has been redefined and redefined in each time by historians and architects. And in fact, looking at it historically, I felt we can gain confidence of redefining it again, because they've been redefined in order to remain relevant for their time. And
the sort of gang who were at the Architectural Association when you were teaching there, Alan Balfour was the chairman. Jeff Kipnis was influential. There was the project in Australia, the Lab one, yes, which seemed to be coming out of this same kind of group of ideas about analysis, about folding and forming, and then going right through to how do you make these things, involving a lot of mathematics. How do you see that part of your career? Did it have more effect on you than you had on the students, or was it a mixture of both? It seemed to have been a kind of fulcrum for a period where these ideas were flowing back and forth.
I think both. It was great to be at the AA because it gave this larger platform. It built ambitions into people. I think that's what's fantastic about teaching at the AA, about being part of these institutions where ideas have let's say, they run ahead of, say, reality. And it gave us that. So at the same time as having one Yokohama, it was very important to know that there was a larger discussion out of the project that we were part of, and that it was very important to keep it. It was very important to keep it. I think Alam Alfour was fantastic, and he really supported us. It was very important as two very young teachers about to practice, to have that support. Jeff Kipnis was very critical, and again, it was very important to be part of that, let's say, cloud, and to participate in the discussions that they were nurturing. But at the same time, I think there was something a bit different about the EEA, because there was a lot of interest in form, in geometrical complexity, in the excitement around digital tools. I think today, probably that excitement has just, grown to its extreme end. Perhaps we see that more in American schools. And I think there was a side to Yokohama which was also being interested in the realization of the form, and not just the form, and not to have a form where the realization is a scaffold to that formal geometrical shape, but that the two inform each other. And I think that has always been the strength of Yokohama, where the two are inseparable, and in a way that I think this is still probably an unfinished project. I think it rests very much in Yokohama. It doesn't belong to Yokohama. There are some fantastic projects earlier on in modernism, and people like Prouvé, let's say, or who've experimented with it at a smaller scale, and Yokohama is a much larger project. So, for example, we can think of other projects where perhaps younger architects have one big scale. You can think of the Sydney Opera House. The Sydney Opera House is interesting, but you could also argue that it's a shape with a function inside. The shape of the sails, etc. Maybe the Pompidou is closer to it in terms of, again, part of the same history of young people having these visions, where the Pompidou is an idea for very large scale, flexible spaces for exhibitions, and the idea of the form and the structure, and therefore its expression in the kind of fabric it sits in, is inseparable from what it's supposed to do. That structure wouldn't make sense for a concert hall. So they are together in a sense that the Sydney Opera House isn't, and in a sense that many of, the experiments post Yokohama don't quite take that on. I'm sure there are some very good examples, but generally speaking, I think there is that project that actually is scaleless.
It was a kind of fractal architecture. And I suppose the theoretical side of your work has come out partly in exhibitions, famously the FOA British Pavilion at the Venice Biennale, exhibitions at the ICA, and then in publications. Firstly, a book about ornament, then secondly, one about to be published on style, and in each of those cases, this idea that neither ornament nor style is simple applique, that actually for it to be successful or to be properly understood, one has to see it as an intrinsic part of the whole. And that is what you achieve in your own work. On the other hand, quite clearly there are people who absolutely treat it as something to be applied and removed at will. Do you have a kind of moral objection to architects who treat style and ornament in that fashion, or do you say, well, let 1,000 flowers bloom?
No, I think there is room for a lot of different approaches to architecture, and I would actually be very unhappy if I thought I was telling people what to do. I'm more interested in giving people a way of doing things, and I think there is a there is, aside from a more, let's say, disciplinar discourse of the relationship between construction and image, or efficiency and expression, etc. I think behind all of this is a real interest in making a difference in people's daily life. It sounds very simple and obvious. I think we architects often can forget that ultimately architecture is about life and it's about making a difference. And I think this connection between the image or the form and what the practicalities that are inside the form is really about connecting the image and the form to how that performs vis-a-vis people's everyday life.
It sounds like a kind of, if one were to invent a new pigeonhole into which to put architects, which of course journalists and critics love to do, this is a kind of neo-functionalist proposition, isn't it? Because what you're doing is saying that the old notion that the building has to be like that because that's the function and it almost writes itself. Firstly, it's not possible to be that simple, but secondly, that architecture has functions other than merely being an envelope for the activity of its occupants, because for one thing it has a relationship with people who look at the building and people who may use the building in different ways. Now I think that your architecture tries to engage at a banal level, at a street level, with people who are not users or occupants of the building, but nevertheless are affected by it. And you've written a lot about, let's say, the affect of something on somebody. This is part of the story, isn't it? That unless you understand that, then you can't have a proper understanding of what the function of that space or volume might be. And in trying to define it, what you've done is to shed a kind of light, almost in an encyclopedic way, on the myriad aspects of three-dimensional design.
I am very interested in this dimension of buildings. I think architects have grown into a situation where they work with a lot of other experts. Some people think architects have lost control because there are, a myriad of other experts telling them what to do. I think actually we work in a richer environment where we are fed by these other experts who are highly skilled and intelligent. And from my own experience, the architect is even more relevant because someone needs to pull all these layers together, connect them. And actually it remains still to be the architect who brings these together. And through these, architects has an incredible amount of power in how it gives presence and how he or she articulates all of these layers into a single object, which has a certain scale, has certain geometries, has certain materialities, has a certain presence through which people come to experience this building and its uses. It's very different if you go and visit a show of Matisse, let's say, in an exhibition in a suite of galleries that are curvilinear versus they are orthogonal. It makes a difference whether they have natural light or not, and whether the light is coming from on top, or it makes a huge difference. And it's the architect who makes these decisions. And we have cornered ourselves into this situation that we think we have to explain everything in terms of, other people's expertise of, whether it's economics or it's the structure. And actually, we are not expert in any one of them. We need to know enough about all of them to pull them together, but we are not the experts, but we have our own expertise, which is to pull them together, And normally, we keep this as a very private conversation, as if it's either not a skill because we are explaining it through other people's expertise, or it's our way of doing it because I'm so-and-so and I always do this way, this is my way of doing it. And I think it's interesting to do neither, to accept that you are working with others, to accept that you are the one who is pulling them together, to talk and articulate the way you're putting together in a very open and deliberate way.
But there's an interesting thing from observation that architects frequently don't talk about, which is that if you ask them why is the building like this, then they'll give answers which in a way reflect all those other experts. But the planner said this, the economist said that, the contractor said that, the engineer said that. But there's, apart from synthesizing, which I suppose is the architect's stock in trade, I sometimes call architects' fees the wages of synthesis. Now, this is not a bad description. But there's another thing, isn't there, which is that it's the kind of magic dust, it's the inspirational thing that actually, why does that building look like that? And it's actually because you were inspired to make it like that, or it's a memory of something, or, famously, Will Alsop said he'd always wanted to design a building like his cigarette lighter. Are there bits of you that you see coming out as artistic inspiration, let's say, which you then synthesize with all the other things?
I think we all look for every possible way to inspire the architectural process, and some of them may be intuitive. But I don't think they're interesting if they remain as that. So it may be that you start from your cigarette packet, but really you're going to have to connect how that becomes relevant to the end result. And the process takes quite a bit of time. It may take a few years, it may take 10 years, and to say that all you did was to make the cigarette packet a project, to me is not convincing enough. So I think all of these inspirations or intuitions are a way to move on. But ultimately, you need to resort to how you are making yourself more informed, more intelligent, more insightful to the project you're trying to. And I think, personally, I love projects that take a long time. At the time, you suffer, but they always become richer. I don't think Yokohama would have been the same if it was fast. In fact, the most luxurious thing for an architect is time. It takes time to go over it, and you get new ideas, you see new things. It just becomes a lot richer.
I'd like to ask you a question about scale. That kind of notion of a sort of fractal architecture sort of going on into the distance. But in your work, do you find that, or do you think that a large project is just a large version of a small project? Or is there a moment where actually large projects, the size and the complexity has its own life, and it's not just a big version of a small thing, it's another thing entirely?
I think there are different scales to a project. So say you were doing a tall building in London, its silhouette and height would of course perform at the wider scale of the city. But that building, if you just designed it for the silhouette, it would fail when you would come near it. So a tall building has a cladding, has an envelope, it needs to work with bringing scale and texture and depth. When you get close to it, it can do all kinds of things to how people move around it. It can do all kinds of things in the way it comes down to the ground. So there is this kind of at least near and far aspect to it. And ideally, you would work at both scales simultaneously. You would not design it at the big scale and then expect to find the detail in it, and you would not expect to grow the silhouette from the detail, because they're actually two different things. So whether you're designing, a shopping mall, a house, or a tower, you would work with both at the same time. And a good project, the idea is in between, is one that pulls them together and gives you both scales rather than one becoming the other.
Now, there are many architects, especially famous architects, who seem to really regard commercial buildings and office buildings in particular, especially speculative office buildings, as sort of dull projects that they almost don't want to despoil themselves by undertaking. You, by contrast, seem to like the challenge of commercial office buildings. Where did that come from?
I find it exciting to contribute where there is contribution to be made. So, for example, we've worked, say, on a contemporary art museum, and it was personally a very enriching experience because I learned more about contemporary art, I learned about museums and people going to museums. But if you really think about what surrounds us, it's probably mostly, office buildings and housing. That's where you can really contribute as an architect, and probably retail. But I think what is interesting is not to reinvent the wheel every time, but to find areas, whatever scale it is, to really make a difference. And, well, we all go to work every day, and it matters. Office where you work, spaces where we work matter. They matter even more now because we work remotely, we can work on the computer, and so there is more pressure on space to bring people together. And I think, why not? I am very interested in making a difference in that area.
And I suppose the examples of the modern masters who had similar interests, I suppose the most obvious one is Mies, and his approach to structure and glazing is something I suppose that all architects in this field in some senses relate to, either by admiring or criticising or reversing. Do you think there are kind of icon office buildings from the last 50 or so years that for you are still great pieces of architecture as well as being good places to work in?
I think London has some really great ones. Swiss Re or 30 St Mary's Axe is one of my favorites because it has managed to contribute to the London skyline. I think even locally of how a tall building can kind of allow free space around it. But also it has rethought the relationship between structure, air movement in a building, space planning. Of course, it was designed for one tenant and others, but it is a great building. Of course, the latest one is Leadenhall, the new Leadenhall building, the cheese grater, which reverses what you normally think of a tower, because office buildings usually try to be largest when land is most valuable at the top. And this is a building that gradually decreases its floor plate size. And, in the academic world, we've been trying to think how to differentiate, the Miesian office building, which is simply extruded, repetitive, beautiful, but simply extruded, repetitive, homogeneous. And people have got into all kinds of academic exercise of differentiating it for the sake of it. And here is a building that has suddenly, either by accident or deliberately, showing us that actually there are tenants who are small and there are tenants who are large, and they want their own front door. And this building gives them all their own front door in a building that diminishes in size gradually. And so it's a different way of thinking about flexibility. Rather than thinking you have a big floor plate and you can subdivide it at will, you create a building that gives different kinds of tenancy size in the same one. And the market leads that. It needs to cater for different scales of office tenants. So I love the building. I love the fact that it plays with both forms and the realities of the market and the flexibility brings, etc.
You've been a successful practitioner for a couple of decades. If you were advising somebody like yourself from when you started, any advice you would give to people about to plunge into the world of architectural practice?
To work hard, to be ambitious, to take on problems that they're at the kind of the full strength and reality, and to keep going.
I want to move to a final question, which is quite a broad one, which is perhaps some reflections from you both as a designer and a teacher, you know, on more than one continent, about where you see architecture heading. If it's possible to describe architecture, as it were, as a single entity, but within which many strands. Are there things that you observe that, you know, when you were teaching at the AA and you were thinking of, you were being inspired and thinking about the things that created Yokohama, can you see movements and discussions that you think might generate different architectures or different approaches in the next few years?
The only thing the only thing I know is that it will not be one. It will not be one. I think we've gone beyond the isms and the single way of packaging, life. There is a lot more complexity in the kinds of problems and scales simultaneously, and they require different responses. And I think we've got over the problem with form, as you know, whether it should be curvy or boxy or deconstructed. I think we've got over that, and I think that makes the playing field a lot richer and a lot more unpredictable. I think a lot more exciting. The fact that we can do almost anything, and what is really I think the opportunity is to bring in the incredible tools that we have to design and to manufacture, produce buildings, with also the kind of the diverse problems that we have. I think the only thing I can say is that architecture will continue going. It will remain relevant. I think space is more and more relevant in a way the more virtual we become, because actually it needs to do certain things that the virtual cannot, and therefore it has relevance. It has relevance. It's not trying to become a scaffold for technology, where perhaps in the Miesian period it was celebrating technology, it was celebrating industry. We can't do that because that's all done at this scale. And so space needs to provide other things than technology can, and therefore I think there is more room for it, and it needs to justify itself, and it will need to make a difference, and I think that's how it will remain relevant.